analogy played a foundational role in Aristotle's philosophy, connecting both to his understanding of causality and psychical activity. I discuss Aristotle's views on analogy and metaphor, and show that his special use of the word energeia has metaphorical and analogical components. His views are not only subtle and insightful, but provide valuable insight for contemporary philosophy. It is well known that analogy played an essential role in the work of Plato and Aristotle. Generally, it has been considered from an epistemological perspective as a means of knowing something indirectly by extrapolating from something different but similar. Plato famously had Socrates give a series of analogies in Books 6 and 7 of the Republic, which describe the good in relation to the soul's activity of striving for knowledge, which culminates in the allegory of the cave. These famous analogies describe the moment of true insight. Aristotle seems to have gone even farther by systematically applying analogy in every philosophical and scientific pursuit. For both, analogy involves the striving of the mind as a psychical activity. The key is that we do not understand this activity, analogical reasoning, on the basis of something else, analogically, but instead we understand the activity and causality of other things on the basis of it. By comparing metaphor and analogy, I uncover phenomenologically distinct features of each as psychical activities and highlight their epistemic value in Aristotle's philosophy. Drawing on the interpretations of Ravissant, Ricoeur, Ubenck, Rodrigo, and Schumacher, I focus on the psychological aspects and processes involved in analogy and metaphor. I claim that analogy is both epistemological and phenomenological. It shows that the latter aspects provide insight into the workings of the mind. I begin by comparing analogy with experience, empiria, and focalization, pros hen, in order to show that analogy plays a fundamental role in all cognitive activities. I then go on to examine the role of analogical metaphor in Aristotle's rhetoric. With this analysis, it becomes clear that psychical activity is the basis on which the mind conceives activities of other varieties, and of causality in general, and is the fundamental phenomenon named by his term, energeia. Analogy is the activity in which the mind gathers and understands the relations between a multiplicity of details that participate in a single form. The mind enacts it all together as a unity while preserving the differences, called a pros hen unity or focalization. We understand a convergence of causal factors in general by an analogy, matter to form, prior conditions to results, potency to activity, etc. In the same way, the soul, as the activity of the body, unifies the potentialities of the organs and directs their movements. The relation of mind to itself is the paradigmatic occurrence of analogy for Aristotle, as it is in no way a metaphor nor indirect. The mind's understanding of itself is an act of understanding. For Aristotle, both metaphor and analogy can give us indirect access to something that we cannot grasp immediately through something we already know. Analogy is related directly with the understanding of form. Metaphor to imagination and transformation. The distinction between motion and activity is a famously difficult question. Even with this distinction, Aristotle conflates them and even relies on metaphor as a means for getting at the nature of the mind in its process of understanding. He famously likens the activity of the mind to a light as illuminating, as well as to touch as an immediate contact. Even the word activity, energeia, is metaphorical in that it is a work or operation, ergon. While Aristotle insisted that motion and activity are different, that metaphor and analogy have correspondingly different epistemic values, he still employed them both and in combination with didactic and heuristic intent. Aristotle's use of analogy ends up being very modern and has insights that are still relevant to contemporary philosophical investigations of mind, causality, and phenomenology. Analogy, experience, and focalization. Analogy is a multifaceted term for Aristotle, with the most general meaning relating to proportion. In this sense, it designates what today we call isomorphism, an intelligible relation which is a noticeable similarity between two different relations. A is to B in the same way that C is to D. This ability of the mind to not only notice similarities, for example, a goat is similar to a horse, but to notice similarities of relations. For example, a tool is similar to a hand, since both are useful for the soul. It points us to a deeper psychological aspect of analogy. Analogy opens up a comparative function of intellectual activity, which discloses the most fundamental kinds of relationality, not merely numerical, but also, and more importantly, qualitative. The relation between unity and multiplicity, especially in relation to causality, is the most fundamental analogy. Analogy itself is a gathering of multiplicity that discovers something that is more than the sum of the parts by grasping them in a way that pertains to the whole as a sui generis unity. This way of understanding things as unities of a convergence of a multiplicity of factors is essential to both Aristotle's views on causality as well as the more cryptic views on pros hen unity. Pros hen unity is closely related to Aristotle's famous phrase that some terms are, quote, said in many ways, such as in Metaphysics 4.1 and in each chapter of Book 5 of the Metaphysics. Some things that are said in many ways are arbitrary, while others trace underlying connections. Justice is said in many ways, but also has a focal meaning. One important sense of justice, called distributive justice, is a proportion, analogon. Aristotle emphasis on the soul as the focal meaning of justice is revealing because it implies that justice not only manifests in many different ways, but that the central sense of it is known only by one who is just and sees what is just and unjust in very different situations of life. Justice emerges in a person's gradual development, involving other virtues like courage and temperance. The virtue of justice depends on the emergence of these virtues and habits as preconditions. This idea is remarkably similar to the ways justice is treated in the Republic, since it is about cultivating virtues and knowledge in the soul in order to become just. Aristotle and Plato's view is that, yes, it is extremely difficult to define justice and to communicate what it is in a sort of legal way. But the reason for this difficulty is not due to the fact that it manifests in many diverse situations, but because you need to be just in order to know what justice is. This is why they are both so concerned with how people can become just, not simply how to formulate a definition. The relation between focalization and analogy has been explored with great clarity by Erich Schumacher. Schumacher argues against Owen's that focal meaning is a coexistence with analogy, is coextensive with analogy, and does so by first of all extending the significance of analogy beyond its mathematical formulation as numerical proportionality. By connecting the two key passages, Metaphysics 4.2 and Metaphysics 12.4, Owen used to differentiate analogy and focal meaning, Schumacher shows how Aristotle's conception of focal meaning and analogy are not identical, but are inverse perspectives on the same double movement, and therefore that each is implied by the other. Analogy emerges in the course of Schumacher's work as more than a mere epistemological device and is revealed to be a general ability of the soul to gather memories, images, perceptions, and thoughts together in a simple whole or unity, which both relates and differentiates what has been gathered together. Analogy is an ability to make the past relevant by gathering again, that is, to think of something on the basis of something else, or to perceive this based on those memories. We can approach this double movement by gathering and differentiating in a way that emphasizes one or the other of these two aspects, that is, focalization or analogy. Owens used these two aspects to try to prove the difference between analogy and focal meaning, referring to the former as an outward comparison and the latter as an inward one. Thus, analogy is said to take up a certain relationship, for example, matter, form, privation. It goes out to things and applies the same relation in varying phenomena. Focal meaning, on the other hand, will draw in many irreducibly different things by connecting them back to a fundamental meaning or definition. Causes are focalized by funneling plurality into a multifaceted unity, as in the example of health. But unlike Owen's account, for Aristotle, health is focalized by the actual concrete dynamic living thing that unifies all the diverse phenomena. Aristotle said that analogy is responsible for how we think of the causes of diversity among natural individuals in Physics 1. We think of two different animals with unique features or behaviors, but with a similarity in their manner of converging several causal ingredients in an integral whole. Health is the concrete ongoing process of making causes converge in a way that maintains vital function. Based on an analogy at this level, we can say healthy horse and healthy human. We do not mean exactly the same thing in each case, as human health does not involve the same things as horse health. They integrate different causes, and their maladies are diagnosed through different signs. Nevertheless, they are both understood through a convergence of causes that have an analogous relation to the condition of an enduring individual. Thus, some degree of the outer movement of analogy is already implied by the convergence of focalization, as it is only by a convergence of causes that there is any analogy between different individuals. Furthermore, every focalization is always already, potentially, an analogical mode of relating causal ingredients. To think health as focalized in one thing is already to think analogically of causes. The very fact that health, justice, and being are all approached as focal unities shows that pros-hen unity is always already an example of analogical reasoning and the most fundamental mode of analogy. Schumacher provides an admirable alternative formulation to the problem by showing that analogy taken as a mere structure of proportion is secondary, derivative, and insufficient to, quote, capture the primary dynamism of the term. He also shows that Owen's interpretation of focal meaning was overly reductive and eliminated the hidden dynamism. The approach of Owen's interpretation was to understand a focalization of the definition, for example, health as a central term in defining healthy food. Schumacher shifts the meaning of focalization away from concepts and definitions to a more concrete sense. It is not a single definition being distributed to other concepts, but a way of thinking the relevance of a diverse set of interrelated but differently significant ingredients of a unified reality. This interpretation emphasizes the relationship between unity and diversity, rather than an abstract relationship that generalizes by subsuming a particular, unity, under a universal, multiplicity. The unity of focalization is instead a unity of real generation, wherein multiplicity is subsumed by unity. The presence of healthy food is enough for the entire reality of health to show itself, but not by merely linking it back to a concept. It is not merely an association based on one's hunger, since the lived process of maintaining health is what makes such an association relevant in the first place. The association cannot be the cause of the idea. It is rather a relevant association to make only because of the general relevance that anything whatsoever in experience, thought, or imagination can have with respect to the active conditions of life that we call healthy or sick. This is exactly how Aristotle thought of the activity of health, and is why he used it as an example of focalization. Health is an active state, or hexis, and is connected directly to the vital principle, psyche, as focused on living and preserving life. It is the tendency by which we spontaneously strive to maintain life. The most fundamental sense of both health and the pros hen are thus teleological. We think of health as a good, as choice-worthy. Health shows up in our awareness on the basis of its preferability. Things are relevant in relation to it, and it is the central axis of relevance by which we perceive things as painful or pleasurable, averse or desirable, adverse or beneficial. The entire sense of life, including strivings of different sorts, strivings for justice, the philosophical life that strives for the uncovering of being, stretching out towards the truth, as he says in the beginning of the Metaphysics. These are animated by the focalizing tendency of the soul, which puts the multiplicity of causal ingredients together in a way that maintains and optimizes its being. Far from a mere logical relation of concepts, focalization and analogy are lived processes involving feelings, actions, and the immediate apprehension of relevance. The fact that something appears as healthy, just, or true always already implies that we notice a common direction or orientation that unifies a multiplicity, and that this is what structures the relevance of the multiplicity to our concrete life. This dynamic sense of health as a hexis must be taken as essential to focalization. Schumacher clarifies how intuition, nous, by relating directly to the principle, arche, involves both analogy and focalization. As Aristotle outlined, this very reliance on principles in our knowledge of nature and the soul is itself analogical. Physics 1 and Metaphysics 9:6. Schumacher's identification of the faculty of intuition with analogy helps us understand how intellectual intuition factors into all human thought. Nous is not merely a theological hypothesis, thinking thought, or a postulate grounding metaphysical syllogisms, but is an indispensable ingredient in concrete human thought. The unity of the material principles of thought and the universals that the soul grasps by intellectual intuition are, more fundamentally, focalized unities. The grasp of principles is described by Aristotle as indivisible, and is said to take place in an indivisible now. But it is also, at the same time, an act of distinguishing the differences, as a point also divides a line in two, De Anima 3:4-6. Nous has a fractured unity, according to Schumacher, which is both indivisible and duplicative or double. This mode of being fractured implies that intuition is not only a simple unity, but is also involved in language and is an ingredient in the gathering of logos. However, it is not reducible to language. He said that, quote, logos makes vocal what nous unifies, end quote. Thus, while language is closely related to nous and focalization and depends on them, it also unfolds in multiplicity. The unity remains intact, its integrity is preserved in nous, while the multiplicity of differences emerge gradually by logos, analysis, and discursive thought. Nous is a precondition for discourse in that the focalizing unity is the basis on which the differences can unfold. Just as we have a sense of health that makes all particular senses relevant, so in syllogistic thought we have a focal sense of relevance by which the principle can be qualified through its relation with a middle term. The thought that this activity, walking, is healthy, or that this animal is healthy, distinguishes or divides the indivisible principle by conceiving it under one of its causal ingredients. The analogical way of thinking about different natural compounds or living beings as peculiar instantiations of energeia is at work in all thought. The original and primary case from which analogy itself is defined is a focal sense derived from thinking itself and later applied to the many. The focalization of thought itself is the active being at work of the soul, thinking, and by preserving its first actuality, knowledge, is the ground of all analogical thought, De Anima 2. Nous in this way goes beyond logos, and it is this aspect, indivisibility, that can include infinite multiplicity and be delimited by a finite plurality of explanations. This appears to be what is at the heart of the very cryptic but blisteringly insightful pages of De Anima 3:6. Aristotle's characterization of the ambiguity of being as a focal sense, known by analogy, is closely related to his claim that being is not a genus. This denial of the generalization and homogenization of focal meaning and analogy was of particular importance to Félix Ravissant in his Essai sur la métaphysique d'Aristote. The rejection of this ontological generality is clear, again, with the example of health. Health is not a general notion of which healthy animal, healthy food, etc. are all specific particular instantiations. Healthy food is not a species of health, one subsumed under the many, but is a unique aspect that is expressible through the same activity, many subsumed under the one. Similarly, being is like healthy in that, for example, the categorical mode of being are just one aspect, but act and power are other aspects irreducible to the categories, and we must include all aspects in the focal sense of the being as this individual, tode ti. Health is enacted in the convergence of healthy food, healthy actions, and doing things for the sake of health. The healthy individual itself weaves these together, not as an abstract juxtaposition, but as the integral act unifying the multiplicity of processes. Health is concrete, a tension holding together a diversity of parts in the active ingredient integrating of its causes. It is also generative in that it produces and sustains itself by unfolding in multiplicity. We find in this portrayal of analogy and focalization a sense of unity among qualitative multiplicity that hinges on the problem of abstract generality and concrete existence. As light is given as an analogy for intuition, we find these four key aspects of Aristotle to be indivisibly united: illumination, intuition, activity, focalization, and analogy. In Pierre Houban's article, Ravissant's interpretation of Aristotle, a higher form of analogy is clearly delineated. It is not verbal, logikos, but deals with substances directly as individuals discovered in experience by a superlogical intuition. Houban concludes, quite rightly, that Ravissant leads us much closer to Aristotle's thought on this topic than any other in his interpretation. The kernel of insight rests on the distinction between two opposite directions in which thought can travel, namely towards abstraction on the one hand and the concrete individual on the other. The two corresponding forms of knowledge are empty logical relations that apply to being by a discrete analogy, in which the terms of relation are identical, and a continuous analogy that progresses as it does, which produces progresses, and as it does, new knowledge is produced in an irreversible direction of development. Houbenc refers to a critical, illuminating footnote in which Ravissant delineated the two directions using two strings of terms or formulas. On the one hand, quote, exoteric, foreign, common, general, logical, logikos in the sense of verbal, and void. And on the other hand, what is proper, own, drawn from existing givens, produced by the thing itself, exact, natural, physikon, in the sense of conforms to the nature of the thing, analytical, philosophical, true. The second list of formulas delimits a domain of concrete individuals, a mixing of matter and form, focalizing activities and potentialities, the integral unity of perfect forms that are always in the process of completing and maintaining themselves. Health is always this toreti, particular individual's current state with its concrete history. The relationship between species and genus is direct, e.g., human and animal, but it is also artificial and external. In the same way, quantity is directly linked to being. These abstract or logical relations are not on the side of truth, although they do contribute to the truth as matter does to form. Unlike mathematical abstraction of discrete proportion, there is an analogy that uses continuous proportion, the parts of which form a sweet or irreversible series in which the latter terms contain the former, which Ravissant called subordination. This chain of continuous links is not a collection of species under a genus and not a direct link of logic or predication, but a real passage of movements gaining power over time by integrating multiplicity. The continuous proportion refers to the focalization of the progression of growth involving many unequal parts. This is essential to the concrete process by which thought emerges in human life. Sensation is to memory what memory is to experience, and again, as experience is to knowledge. Each is an actual stage in the gradual emergence of knowledge. This continuity of powers and activities is a series of actual analogies describing the developmental process of all habituation and learning. Taking this continuous proportion as a paradigmatic of all life and thought, the continuous proportion, the good sense of analogy, is found to be at work in all experience and in the concrete intuition of principles. It explains developmental progress and is the cause of the actual emergence of such knowledge. Living activity integrates, pros hen, many different actions, habits, pleasures, and skills by putting them to use in higher forms of intentionality. While Aristotle leads us up to the summit of pure activity, which necessarily goes beyond the human to the point at which we find an unmoved mover, the intermediary compounds, moved movers, are what is of particular importance, where individuals have analogical ways of being. They are what must be conceived dynamically and developmentally. Despite being launched by the study of nature into the stratosphere of astral theology, we cannot simply reside at the summit, motionless, in pure thought thinking itself. All we can do to stay in astral theology is to remain in a circle of solar metaphor. But this always remains at a distance. We cannot, as passive intellects remaining in a pure thought of motionless activity. How we move between these views of activity and motion, unmoved mover versus moved mover, is of critical importance to preserving the dynamic view of life which Aristotle describes. The immediate descent from pure intellect will produce only abstract knowledge, a God that thinks the forms, and in that thought is contained the idea of a human. This descent says that the concrete human follows by necessity from the mind of God, whose ideas of the form of living things is the truest cause. We will have walked ourselves into a sort of Neoplatonic emanation ontology, which Bergson accused Aristotle of doing in Creative Evolution. The reality of movement and the activity of life will be mere diminutions of the divine motor power as it dissipates and decays by dint of these distances of its effects from their source. We can avoid this problematic view by taking the opposite approach, by claiming that only the assent has the ability to make a ontological claim, while the dissent is merely abstract and logical, pertaining to epistemology. The ontological, in this sense, arises from phenomenological investigations, while the epistemological arises from analysis. Only by remounting the chain of causes, by actually rising up with our soul into more intense movements and activities, will the meaning of moved mover become dynamic and developmental. This approach preserves the concrete singularity of growing the powers of life and soul in a series or suite, the true being of which consists of progress unfolding gradually, a continuity through developments. The descent represents an inversion of reality. It smuggles along and conceals a falsehood that distorts our knowledge of reality. Being becomes nothing more than a coordination of species under a genus, a catalog of abstract forms without reality, the continuous analogy in the actual lived emergence of powers and activities in the soul is a movement that rises from multiplicity into higher unity, a convergence and growth of multiplicity by integration or focalization. The essence of psychical activity is not only grasped in its existence, but is tied to embodied life, habit, learning, and our individual life history. Energeia is concrete, and the truth of its essence is disclosed to the soul in the event of its own activity. Analogical metaphors. In this section, I will show that the meaning of energeia, as coined by Aristotle, is formed by what he called analogical metaphor, and it describes the inner sense of psychical life. Energeia, first and foremost, names psychical activity. The term focalizes many diverse aspects of psychical activity: vividness, attention, vivacity, agential action, and intentionality. My key insight is that vividness, energeia, is a key component to his crafting of the word energeia, and further that activity literally translates to both being at work and manifesting in work. Metaphor will be shown to have the power, quote, to produce learning in an easy and pleasurable way, and furthermore, quote, produces rapid learning in us, end quote. By mixing metaphor and analogy, one can tap into a rhetorical power to bring their subject matter to life by giving it movement and vivacity. This ability arises from the speaker's appeal to the lived activities of the soul, which are analogous to the activity they are metaphorically interposed with. In Rhetoric 3:10 and 11, Aristotle examines elegance, asteia, which is a way of rendering things vividly in speech. He explains this with his own metaphor of, quote, setting things before the eyes, end quote, which is the effect of analogical metaphor, which he says signify energeia, activity. Analogical metaphor is differentiated from metaphor more generally. The former requires that two things connected by the metaphor not merely share a quality or attribute like completeness of a square or the quality of a just person or upright person, and that they also involve activity. For instance, according to Aristotle's examples, to say that a good man is four square is a metaphor since both a square and a man are complete, but the phrase does not express activity, which is essential to an analogical metaphor. Aristotle gives many examples of analogical metaphor, many of which evoke the internal life and intentionality to inanimate things. Homer, he says, often speaks of inanimate things as if they were animate by making use of metaphor, giving them life and movement. It is not only by placing activities before our eyes that his speech is elegant in this sense, but because the activities in question are deep sentiments related to the inner life of the soul. Aristotle claimed that Homer's popularity is due to his wittiness in bringing inanimate things to life, and gives the following example. Downward again to the plain rolled the ruthless stone. Aristotle rewrites this metaphor as an analogy. For as the stone is to Sisyphus, so is the shameless person to the one shamefully treated. Being ruthless and longing signify activities, and we catch a glimpse of the inner life of things as moving and acting with intent. There are several important things to notice in this example. First of all, in the misquoted Euripides line, quote, "Thereupon the Greeks darting forward with their feet," end quote. The Greeks are moving swiftly and so do things which are darting or shooting. Both do the same action and enact the same intention. There is a further level of analysis which gives us insight into the phenomenological dimension of analogical metaphor. The fact that asteia makes us learn quickly, mathesis takeion, introduces a sort of reflexivity between the content of the particular example of analogical metaphor and the darting action of all metaphorical language more generally. Elegance is, so to speak, an activity manifesting in work, placing activity before the eyes. It is the being at work of the soul making use of the activity of inner life to give quick and easy insights into their subject matter. Not only does it make the content more lively, but it makes the soul of the listener more lively, mobile, and active. The second thing to notice is that while anarges does not occur in the rhetoric, there are semantic intertwinings which tie vividness to the movement of placing activity before the eyes and producing quick learning. The word is based on argos, which in Homeric usage can mean swiftness. Argos also means glancing or shimmering, which implies a quick flash of light, as when Homer describes the brightness of Zeus's lightning bolts. Aristotle describes poetic language itself as a sort of motion. He relates the word metaphor, metaphora, to epiphora, transference. Metaphor is something used, kreisthai, in different ways. And usage involves two different, though related, problems. First, it implies a concrete historical community of language involving common acceptable words and foreign words. Next, it involves several different relations through which the transference of meaning can travel. First, genus replaces species. Second, species replaces genus. Third, species replaces species. And fourth, by analogy. Footnote. He provides the following examples for each. First, my ship stands here. Mooring is a species of standing. Second, 1,000 noble works has Odysseus accomplished. 1,000 has been used instead of multiplicity. Third, drawing off life with bronze and cutting with slender edge bronze bowl. End quote. Drawing off is used in place of cutting and vice versa. 4. When B is to A as D is to C, then instead B, the poet will say D, and B instead of D. Thus the phrase, quote, sowing its divinely nourishing flame, so that seed is to sowing as the sun is to the power of warming. And so the word sowing is substituted for a word that would be equivalent to the sun's insemination, imparting activity to the world. In the first case, we substitute something specific with the general. In the second, the general is replaced by something specific. In the third, we move between two specifics, a bowl drawing off liquid, a sword cuts, and they are substitutable for one another. It should also be noted that in these two examples, Aristotle gives bronze acts as a common underlying matter for the actions of the bowl and sword. End footnote. Metaphor by analogy works by drawing a comparison between two different activities. What analogy adds to metaphor is the possibility of getting at something which has no name. We lack a word for the life-giving activity of the sun, and so we substitute our conception of sowing and fertility from human life. The poet evokes an inner life and intentionality which is transferred to the action of the sun. Evocation invites us to install ourselves immediately in the manifesting in work itself as if we were living it. This rhetorical device employed in philosophy joins the content of the metaphor with its mode of production, i.e., invention. The flash of illumination of these lightning bolts of wit bring to life the very vivacity and vividness of the metaphorical act itself. The power of this vividness depends on the appeal made to the listener's own sensibility. It evokes and instills a sense of vitality. Evocative language does not succeed by demonstrations requiring logical deductions, but rather they are successful if they attract us to make the conversions for ourselves. Homer evokes the interiority of the movement which is characteristic of energeia as a living activity. Quote, he makes everything into something that moves and lives, and activity is movement. While the genius of Homer is often the way he brings the inanimate to life, blurring a category difference which is used by Aristotle in De Anima 2:1, the purely imaginative transference of metaphor is not the only way it can be used. The analogical metaphor reveals the common feeling of life that as an interior guiding movement, kubernetikos, as in the Republic. Despite the apparent attempt to separate the animate and inanimate, there are times that Aristotle turns to metaphorical transference of an interiority of the soul, energeia, to nature, like when he refers to a desire which directs the simple bodies, or refers to the heavens as participating in life, in De Caelo, a striving of matter towards form in the metaphysics, or when he says that if an axe had a soul, it would be the activity of cutting in De Anima. No doubt, Aristotle transferred psychological characteristics of energeia to the dynamics of nature, and while rejecting hylozoic ontology, retained an organic cosmology. The whole cosmos is a living being, and the simple bodies imitate life. The dynamism of nature is understood by analogy to the activity of the soul, and metaphor can help us learn about the inner principles at work in natural processes, as he says in Generation and Corruption. Rhetoric is not a remote discipline separated from philosophy and metaphysics. It is an integral part of Attic philosophical processes of coming to first principles, rooting them in a mythopoetic as much as a mathematical paradigm. The evidence and vividness of principles. The central importance of energeia in Aristotle's coining of energeia is made all the more obvious by considering its role in science, which proceeds by way of induction, apogoge, as described in Prior Analytics 23. Induction involves a vivid awareness by means of experience. Through it, we discover the principles at work in phenomena of nature. Induction achieves intuitions by bringing facts, quote, before the eyes, or by another metaphor, arrests and drags suspects into court to testify to a magistrate. Empirical knowledge begins only when phenomena bear witness to underlying causes. Induction is energeisteron, more vivid than demonstration, and the deductive knowledge of the science depends on it. The principles, quote, come to rest in the soul, like soldiers in battle who, one by one, retake their position, another metaphor. The evidence which clearly displays the underlying nature suddenly is noticed. This could happen in the observation of the drying of sap and posterior analytics, in the physiological changes which accompany emotions, or in the acts of the soul itself, as described in the problems. What is evident is not what appears immediately, but only appears over time by careful observation, when memory collects many unique moments together and we find the hidden thread connecting the changes. Experience brings us to the evidence of principles, but we must open up to them in the right way in order to gain insight. The human body, for instance, appears to be healing and growing itself. It evidently acts according to principles, but the evidence of this inner principle of life manifesting in work is not yet understood in terms of its component causes, the three principles: matter, form, privation, or the four causes: matter, form, motion, end. Discursive thought considers the entity in relation to causes explained through demonstrative knowledge, but this knowledge is necessarily dependent on sensible intuitions of evidence. Evidence, energeia, arises in experience, and the principles discovered in the particulars come to stand episteme in the soul as a universal, or according to the whole, kath holon. The most fundamental principles, energeia and entelikeia, come to rest or to take a stand in the soul by both analogy and metaphor. In Metaphysics 9:6, Aristotle gives a synoptic analogy, analogon synopson, which proceeds by induction. This is meant to make clear, delon, the priority of energeia with respect to ways of being in immediate intuition. Through it, we can catch a glimpse of the establishment of this principle in action. Aristotle draws this analogy by assembling witnesses from a heterogeneous assortment of natural relations involving activity. The differences should not be collapsed. As he says, things are said to be actively not in the same way but analogously. Indeed, we find a great deal of differences between the examples given. Quote, what is building in relation to what is capable of building? What is awake in relation to what is asleep? And what is seeing in relation to what has its eyes closed but has sight? And what has been shaped out of matter is in relation to the matter? And what has been completely worked out in relation to something left unworked? From Metaphysics, my translation. The relation is both the same and different in each case. Builders do not innately have their art, it must be acquired, while all animals have alternating periods of sleeping and waking. Seeing and having eyes shut is not the same as sleep, although the eyes are closed in sleep. One does not stop or start having the ability to see by closing the eyes, though it does stop being used. So these are not the same, they each imply different temporal relations. Nevertheless, these three encompass the sensible intuition, how it is duname, energeia, and entelikeia. A builder feels their ability to build as really existing. The open eye, which is seeing, is really manifesting in work. Sleep is a preserving of the soul, being at work, staying itself, or holding itself together completely. These three temporal phases exist evidently in the immediate givens of our sensible and inner intuition. The difference is stretched even further by relating matter to the finished product of an operation of informing, determining, or distinguishing. Here we have an aspect of aesthetic intuition arise again. Now, matter appears as whatever is available to be worked into another form by intentional processes, techne, and it is either fully worked out or it is something left idle, unworked. The unworked is able to be worked, it has power, and it is matter. Thus, we see that the dynamic and energetic senses of being, temporalizing reality in a variety of different ways, to think existence as dynamic, to think of the soul as active, and to think of thought as a fundamental principle, we must gather and distinguish all these senses of being. Analogy presents being in a way that is irreducible to presence to consciousness or concepts. Furthermore, the analogy is not a way of reducing many differences to one model, but of collecting the differences and perceiving them as a whole ensemble. We are presented with another set of opposing terms describing the dynamic sense of being in Metaphysics 5:7. Quote, we say both of what is potentially sees and of what actually sees, that it is a seeing, and in the same way, both of what is able to use scientific knowledge and what is using it, that it is a scientific knowledge, and both of what has already begun to rest and what is capable of resting as rests. Similarly, too, in the case of substances, we say that Hermes is in the stone and that half the line is in the line for what is not yet ripe, that it is grain. In each case, we have a pair of terms that mutually displace one another, that cannot be coexisting together in the same part in the same way, as Aristotle says of all principles in Metaphysics 4. The value of the relata and the ways of relating are not the same in each case. Some matter can be made into a statue is not the same as having closed eyes. They have different temporal and developmental implications. They are ingredients in a convergence of causal ingredients in a different way. In each case, what we have is a dynamic relationship which entails certain consequences. The analogy brings together differences, and the convergence of it all in an intuition discloses an irreducible temporal depth of dynamic being which operates by inner principles of convergence and manifests in psychical phenomena of motion. The intellectual intuition, such as of mathematical truth, also works by collecting syllogistai and gathering multiplicity, and involves an activity of the mind. Aristotle tells us that geometrical, quote, schema are devised actively, and this activity consists of distinguishing dihoruntes, that is indispensable to the event of sight. Aristotle emphasizes this by noting that if the schema had already been distinguished, then it would have already been evident, phanera, how the conclusion necessarily follows. But this insight does not become evident until the diagrams have actually been drawn and actively distinguished, and thus, for one who has already acted in this way, distinguishing, it will be, quote, immediately clear on seeing. It is not immediately clear at the start, during the activity of constructing the schema, nor even while distinguishing the parts. The intellectual energy required to initiate the work of actually distinguishing each part, and this is continuous with the prior stages, but the insight arises after having distinguished them when we finally grasp them all as a whole. The whole is not merely a juxtaposition of the parts, it must be an integration of the parts as interpenetrating and reciprocally dependent. It is the cooperation of the parts and the qualitative relation of them all to each other as a whole. The focalization and convergence of phenomena shows itself and makes evident the principle orienting and the operations and ordering the multiplicity. Aristotle analyzes this event of insight with the example of how we come to know the essence of the triangle, that the interior angles equal 2 right angles. The insight is not the process, it is what the process discloses, i.e. the unity of the parts all working together. We must go and construct the diagram for ourselves and distinguish the parts and let the relations emerge together so that we see how its inner angles necessarily equal 2 right angles in principle. We see this necessity, quote, because the angles around one point are equal to 2 right angles. If the line had already been drawn outward parallel to the sides, why this is so would be immediately clear on seeing it. The proof which he refers to can be found in Euclid's Elements 1:32. By actively drawing the parallel lines which make visible the proportionate angles, we see clearly how the angles will always be able to be combined on the line to equal 2 right angles. The student in geometry will need to draw several different triangles in order to see how it applies in each case, but they need not see every triangle, of which there are an infinite number. The operative principle is discovered by being actively employed in distinguishing the different parts of each schema. It is not just that we know it must be true because of the demonstration. It's not simply that we become exhausted by performing the operation and eventually abandon skepticism motivating our activity. The real insight emerges as immediately evident in the particular case once the principle is discovered. After having constructed the whole diagram, the mind must actively distinguish the parts and hold it all together in one continuous thought. The complete picture is more than a diagram. It involves a whole series of operations by which thought moves within the idea and focalizes the multiplicity into an integral whole. having not only traced the lines, but also underlining them with the insight into the relation they hold together as a whole, the why will be, quote, clearly seen by the one who beholds. This is because the principle can come to stand in the soul. The essence of the triangle is manifest in existence. Stated as analogical metaphors, devising schema is the work of the mind, and this activity is what kindles the understanding as a light in the soul. Given the fact that energeia refers to the visible or palpable manifestation of a divinity, theophany, we should not fail to notice the connotation of divine manifestation that is imparted on the principles and our apprehension of them, as in Nicomachean Ethics. Sophia is the virtue of the soul and intellect, which is semi-divine. Nicomachean Ethics 6:7 and 10:6-8. As it denotes a communion with the most fundamental realities, the archai. What this examination of the process of thinking reveals is a developmental way that thought is gradually constructed by a subordinate series of actualizations in which the powers of earlier moments are preserved and put to work in later stages, a continuous proportion. To put it bluntly and in metaphysical terms of fabrication, the schematizing activity brings about a matter or potentiality which is then ready at hand to be put to work in thought or activated. This is a theme Aristotle returns to again and again, that some prior knowledge is required which will play the role of matter for new thoughts to be produced. Once the diagrams have been drawn by psychical activity produced by the activity of noesis, the potential emerged from the activity, the new activities from the potentiality. The power to immediately understand an infinite number of different particular figures is discovered or invented, heurisketai, by enacting them. Thus the soul holds the powers which it acquires, each of which is indeterminate insofar as it can apply in a plurality of cases. The thought which grasps not only the parts, points, lines, angles, not merely the assemblage of them as a totality of relations given in a particular figure, nor again is it the image in which the parallel line is drawn, but rather this thought includes, in a way, all possible triangles. It is not a thought that is divided, distinguished, actualized in a figure. It is not a generality, but rather a directing idea which engenders and orients the activity of thinking. The thought produced will be greater than the sum of its parts, as the focalization of them. This focal unity of enacting thinking is the analogical basis of dynamic causal thought in general. The work of the soul is an operation of informing multiplicity, and although it is an intellectual activity, it also involves imagination and an image. Analogy is based on the focalizing, be it the many senses of being, the diversity of causes, or the indeterminacy of pre-existing knowledge in formal, integrated unity of concrete principles and individuals. Energeia, after having been brought to light in the detailed observation of many different particular cases, thereupon shines brightly in the intellect and illuminates the many ways that dynamic unities emerge from multiplicity by the work of psychical activity. When the soul of a, quote, experienced philosopher turns inward, the entirety of what is potentially thinkable, all memories in their heterogeneous detail, seems to lie there as matter, ready to be collected into syllogisms or at least into chains of recollected association. The soul is a great storehouse harboring potentialities that develop in a continuous proportion in a suite of increasing intensity in the course of an individual's singular history. It is this work, energeia, of the soul that is the most evident energeia principle on which all others are based. Conclusion. While metaphor is different from analogy, Aristotle shows how they are intertwined in the very same way movement and activity are intertwined, manifesting in work and being at work. It is both enacting and enacted. The acquisition of knowledge involves the institution of an ability and a new sense as both meaning and orientation and direction of motion. What endures and what is maintained. To have learned means to possess what was acquired in a continuous proportion or analogy. The mind is both agent and patient as well as capacity, activity, and actuality. The agent mind acts by dividing, distinguishing, separating, choosing. Thinking involves both agent and patient, and looked at from one side will involve movements woven into a continuous thread by the unity of thinking itself. This duplicity of being internal to acting and also externalized as resulting in movements is paralleled in the word ergon as making and made. This duplicity is implicit in energeia, which I have tried to underline with my translation, manifesting in work. Energeia draws together the infinite variation of concrete movements and the unity of intention of the soul's focalizing multiplicity. Aristotle uses metaphor to get us to an immediate grasp of what the word energeia only points at. Aristotle's metaphorical description of the desire of simple bodies explains his tangential remarks in De Anima that study of the soul proves to be helpful in the study of nature. The soul is the principle of living things, and we know this reality by striving and being aware of our existence in the very activity of striving. Furthermore, to speak of the activity of the mind as, quote, work is already a metaphor as well as improvement, therapeuein, of the mind in Nicomachean Ethics, or its grasping, labein, again in Nicomachean Ethics, or hupolambane in De Anima, and illuminating truth in De Anima. Think also of the metaphors at play in words penser, conceive, or reflect. All Aristotle's efforts to describe the works of the mind are metaphors meant to assist us in focalizing an immediate intuition of psychical activity, which both transcends and grounds all language and even all analogy, which is evidently more fundamental than linguistic expression. Ultimately, the mind is not known to us by indirect metaphor, but is instead known immediately by being lived. When we reflect on the act of reasoning by analogy, we find the mind at work unifying multiplicity and activating potentiality, and this fundamental operation is the most evident principle of all our experience and knowledge. It is on the basis of this real immediacy that we understand all other causality and dynamic relations. Talking about the soul and the mind is as difficult today as it was in ancient times. We can make use of metaphors to describe different aspects of our psychological activity, and now it is commonplace to conceive of the mind on analogy of a computer or a machine. What I find to be so interesting in this aspect of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy is that the basis of understanding reality is first and foremost the soul, and it is on the basis of living and thinking that we understand, by analogy, the causal dynamics of nature. This puts things in the opposite order of much of modern and contemporary thought, especially mechanistic reductionism and logical positivism, which come to a formulation of physical reality or of conceptual coherence and then apply that to the mind in order to explain it away. But, as Alfred North Whitehead said, quote, hard-headed men want facts and not symbols, and attempt to expel meaning and metaphor from reality with a pitchfork. Quote, however you may endeavor to expel it, it ever returns. Paul Ricoeur's assertion that the art of rhetoric has more or less died in the last 100 years, and especially in its close relation with philosophy, suggests that metaphor has lost traction as a philosophical device. There are nevertheless many famous examples of philosophers who have relied heavily on metaphorical use of language to convey their insights and thoughts. Henri Bergson, who Bertrand Russell described as a strong visualizer, delivered the most important insights of his philosophy descriptively by means of metaphors. The method he prescribed for metaphysics requires a series of metaphors which converge on a single intuition of the reality unmediated. Phenomenology is also indebted to metaphor in its creation of, quote, phenomenological descriptions. Think here of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's highly expressive use of terms like style, modulation, field, norm, horizon, and flesh. Metaphor directs us to the structure of perception and habituation. It combines many phenomena in such a way as to make them cohere in a single sense. Something as simple as a gesture cannot be understood unless we take stock of its metaphorical sense-making expressivity and the focalization we must undergo in order to see the multitude of bodily movements as an indivisible whole. Not only does phenomenology need metaphor and focalization, but the same source of analogy as described above seems to be required by this method, i.e., the immediate apprehension of the essence of consciousness. If there really can be a focalization of metaphor, then the events of creative and insightful emergence are the basis on which we understand various phenomena analogically. Metaphor, focalization, and analogy, three interdependent but irreducibly different fundamental ingredients in the activity of philosophizing. The essence of the activity of consciousness is the silent thesis of all of our thoughts, that thinking always already knows what it is and what it wants to accomplish, and logic and rhetoric only help it achieve what it always already intended, clear and distinct knowledge. Unlike René Descartes, who accepts only one type of clear and distinct idea with varying degrees of perfection, Aristotle, I think it can be said without becoming too anachronistic, allowed for several modalities of knowledge production, each with its own standards, structures, and genesis. He even relies on integrations of several modalities in emergent, sui generis forms of knowledge, and these again have their own internal standards. For example, prohairesis mixes thought and desire. Rhetoric, metaphor, and first philosophy, analogical observations achieving an intuitive focalization, end up being much more intertwined and ultimately inseparable, just as transcendental fields, in the invisible, always remain within the concrete phenomena visible and in historical meaning. Analogy is often attacked by post-structuralists as a tool of the old guard, a pillar of Thomas Aquinas' hierarchical metaphysics, a relic of the project of subsequent logocentric system construction. Old, worn-out metaphors become the a priori concepts of modernity, vague and rough ideas which have come about by defacement, by being passed around like coins. Derrida, 1974. Energeia has certainly fallen prey to a debasement of this sort, and along with it, the more concrete and profound sense of analogy in Aristotle. Analogy as the correlate of focalization is not a reductive logical simplification, not the logic of an either-or, but of both-and. The meaning of focalization is closer to Derrida's différance than it is to an Aufhebung that gradually abstracts and erases complexity, detail, and ambiguity. It lets being be said in many ways without eliminating its concrete dynamism. And energeia in this sense functions very similar to Whitehead's word concrescence, which names a fundamental way of being that is almost too fundamental to talk about at all. Aristotle's dynamic metaphor by analogy sets psychical life before our eyes in a way that makes us see the concrete whole as greater than the sum of the parts, as a process of oriented but dynamic transformations irreducible to the rearrangement of static elements or information. Aristotle's views on metaphor and analogy still have a great deal to teach us today about the nature and the origin of meaning. They invite us to begin again and put language to use in novel ways that can help us better understand the ambiguity of being.